I knew that cheesemaking and dairying was something I was really interested in, but I knew that what I wanted to explore was raw milk cheese and farmstead cheesemaking, where you're making cheese on the same site where the animals live.
That was Trevor Warmedahl talking about his new book, Cheese Trekking, How Microbes, Landscapes, Livestock, and Human Cultures Shape Terroir. And he's our guest on this episode of booksaboutfood.com, the podcast. He joined us from a very sunny Ojai, California, and if you listen closely, you can hear the birds chirping away in the background. I'm your host, James Reford. Thanks for joining. Congratulations on the book. It seems to be doing well, getting a lot of notice.
Yeah, it has, and it's been a huge benchmark for me, obviously, in my journey, and so I'm happy to be ready to get back out and start traveling again. I'm leaving on Sunday, actually, to fly to Albania. So
If you had to write a job description for yourself, how would you put that? How would you write that down?
I am a nomadic cheesemaker, fermentation educator, and writer who researches and then writes about the relationships between livestock, landscapes, microbes, and human cultures.
Well, that's pretty detailed for sure. Well, it's interesting because no, that when you include nomadic and cheese making in the same sentence, because cheese making is generally a fairly stationary process because you have to stay in the area with everything, but you're nomadic, which I find interesting.
Yeah, no, it's true. It seems like a strange combination, but then this is one of the things that drew me to a country like Mongolia is that it's a culture of nomadic cheese making, like semi-nomadic. Maybe that's a more accurate term, but they're moving seasonally, and this is one of the things that really it has intrigued me about older ways of dairying, is this idea of moving animals to where there's food, and that still takes place in a lot of the world as that older approach has kind of slowly been eroded, and people now keep animals in one place and bring the food to them.
Well, I guess certainly now I'm thinking about it. Switzerland, I know or in the Alps, they would move the animals up in the summer, bring them down in the winter, but everything gets collected in one area and made there. So I guess maybe my first statement was wrong. Maybe it is semi-nomadic to begin with, or used to be.
Yeah, and that's a great example, is those like vertical transhumance systems that still function in Europe, of moving animals up in the summertime and coming back down. But like, so the this lifestyle has really appealed to me, and I've kind of what I'm searching for is a way that I can be a nomadic cheesemaker in the modern context, and I think I've kind of carved out a way of doing that, with education and writing, so I can travel and document and do this stuff all at the same time.
Well, how did you come into this career, or how did this interest develop with you?
I came out of I've always loved to cook and eat, and so am a recovering picky eater. As a child, I was had an incredibly limited diet, and then as I got interested in cooking and traveling, I slowly like expanded as I learned that I could like foods that I was formerly you know had a distaste for, and so through cooking in restaurants, I got into different types of fermentation and was like making sourdough pizza dough, and like I loved cooking, but I didn't really want to do it as a job. There was some unhealthy aspects of working in back of house, and I just kind of randomly took a job making cheese in downtown Seattle, and this was now 16 years ago, and learned a lot about cheese making, but quickly realized that it was like a model of cheese making that I was opposed to, of pasteurizing milk from cows that I never saw, and using commercial starter cultures to ferment that milk. And so I knew that cheese making and dairying was something I was really interested in, but I knew that what I wanted to explore was raw milk cheese and farmstead cheese making, where you're making cheese on the same site where the animals live. So spent 10 years bouncing around the U.S. working for different companies, kind of looking for a model that made sense to me.
And so, is this how the book came about? Just from 10 years of bouncing around and the experience and the education, and I guess wanting to pursue it further?
Yeah, the travels and the book grew out of my dissatisfaction with cheesemaking in the U.S., realizing all of the constraints that were on cheesemakers, and kind of coming to realize that if I wanted to learn about more natural approaches to making cheese that didn't involve a lot of the purchased inputs, especially the starter cultures, that I needed to visit other parts of the world where these more traditional approaches still existed. And so that became the search, um, of the first couple trips, was just looking for places where older ways of working with livestock and fermenting milk still existed, and then it just kind of grew from my own interest and like search. It grew into something that's now more than I ever planned it to be, to where it's kind of become my life and livelihood.
And you have some very interesting destination choices, which make sense in the context, but I think for the greater public or for most people, I don't know a lot of people who've been to Mongolia or Albania. Maybe a few have been to Georgia, but certainly nobody that I can think of has been to all three.
Yeah, no, it's true, and I'm trying to focus on countries that get less attention for their cheese, to kind of move away from a Eurocentric model of what good cheese is. And a country like Mongolia is a perfect example of a place where older approaches to working with milk still exist. Like most of the cheeses they make don't even use rennet, so they're like these ancestral techniques. So these are some of the places that I'm drawn to. I'm also really interested in kind of post-communist or post-Soviet countries like Albania, post had a communist dictatorship, and that like put this huge um, like barrier on the development of their agriculture, so that you kind of have this older form of agriculture still exists there, very like pastoral, um, like herders walking with animals. So their food system was never industrialized, so it's a really unique country for that reason. And there's just some fascinating cheeses that are made. um, Georgia like gets all this attention for its wine, but it has equally old traditions of cheese making. Um, and it doesn't get the attention for its cheese. It's not as well known, and it's not as much celebrated. Um, but a country like Albania, there's so much to explore in just that one small country, and this is one of the reasons why I'm now going back for the third time, to revisit some of the places I've been before, and to see some new stuff. So it's it's becoming more of a destination. It's like becoming more popular for tourists, for American tourists. You're starting to see Americans in Albania, and the tourist economy is just taking off there. So I'm also hoping to see some of this stuff before it kind of becomes theatrical, or like too much tourism can go in a really bad direction. So I know I'm kind of a part of the onslaught of like tourists coming to these places, but I'm exploring different models of what that can look like for the people who live there, and if there's some sort of like responsible tourism that is going to benefit the producers and the knowledge holders, who I think are hoping to keep these old ways alive.
It's certainly, I see the fine line you're discussing. You're going in as a researcher, but are you in some way a tourist? And
Yeah.
well, and how is your presence accepted in some of these places? Are you viewed as a tourist or an American interloper?
Mm. It's mixed. It depends kind of on what the state of tourism is in these regions, but the across the board, I've been blown away by the incredible hospitality that I've been shown. everywhere that I've gone. And especially when I get to these kind of remote places that maybe don't have a lot of tourism yet, and it's kind of just developing, like things like guest houses and guided trips. Um, I, I still I'm not being treated like I'm just something to extract money from. I think there's still this like old sense of like when guests arrive, you treat them like you like lavishly feed them and treat them really well. And that, now you're paying for this hospitality, but still there's something about it that seems less extractive. Um, in a few places that I've been, like I'm going to places that are kind of inherently conservative, like in social values and norms. That like that goes hand in hand with this search for these old ways of making cheese and working with livestock and the old breeds. It's like I run into a lot of regions that have maintained their sense of independence by being a little bit hostile to outsiders. Um, but I've only experienced a little bit of skepticism that usually I can maneuver through when people can see, I think, that my intentions are good and that I'm actually interested in learning about these traditions and talking about them and sharing the information, and that I'm not trying to profit off it. And so that I think has gotten me a long ways. And if when there is skepticism, I think I have to be understanding of that um, and realize that there's reasons for hostility.
Well, is the reverse also true in the sense that you show up somewhere remote and people are just pleased to that you're taking interest in what they do, not for profit, but they're proud of their work and they are happy to show it off.
Yeah, absolutely. That's been the overwhelming experience. That the people who are doing this work pretty quietly, often, of just making these cheeses, milking their animals and farming in these old ways, that they are doing it like almost as a statement of resistance or stubbornness. Um, and I think it's rewarding to them to see that somebody like me comes and finds value in that work and wants to share it with a wider audience. Um, so generally, people just share very freely with me all of the information about like their recipes and techniques. And when I first started, I thought that what I was going to be doing was collecting like definitive recipes for how to make cheeses. But what I've realized is that like the idea of a standard recipe falls apart in the way that cheeses have been made historically and still are today. It's more of a process that's being followed, but there's a lot of juggling or like altering the steps in the process to steer towards a moving target. And that what was actually really important for the deliciousness of these foods was less something that could be replicated somewhere else and more about the quality of the milk itself, the breeds of animals, and like the equipment, the tools, and the spaces in which people are making cheese. That all these things come together to create foods with terroir, cheeses with terroir, and that can never be reduced to a recipe. And I realized that was what should be celebrated, these kind of more ephemeral and cultural elements of cheese making. And that those are things that can be kind of, you can base cheeses on that, or you can like take the style and the general approach and do it anywhere in the world. But then it becomes its own thing as terroir is allowed to emerge over time.
I can see that, and I can see how you could take a recipe from Mongolia and show up in Vermont, and you would probably get a completely different product because it is cheese making is such a almost say personal, for lack of a better word, but so unique to a specific area.
Yeah, I think that's true. And there's like kind of this tension between like how much of it is just like pure chemistry, and a lot of it is, a lot of like what makes a cheese become itself can be explained chemically. Um, but then the more you look into that chemistry, you realize how nuanced it is, and like the impossibly dense number of variables. Just like milk itself is incredibly complex. And So I've kind of quickly kind of given up on trying to wrangle all those variables and realized that the deliciousness and the transcendental beauty of some of these cheeses I've had, that those experiences go beyond what our objective minds can explain, and that's actually something to be celebrated, and something that I think is often too lacking in our approaches to food and the more science focused mentality of trying to create foods that express the places and the people who live there, that those things just happen over time spontaneously, and I don't know that it can be coerced into happening.
Unfortunately, I can't take credit for this, but in another interview, you said you had mentioned the infinite number of possibilities for creation and taste. And I think that leads into the concept, the fact that I think a lot of that is being lost, I think. And
Hmm. I would agree, and this is sad that like a food like cheese, that is infinitely diverse and can be such a local manifestation, that every effort of our industrial food system is to remove those variables, to like simplify the things, like the ingredients, simplify the milk, try to make it like the same year round and standardize it, simplify the cultures down to a few strains that are grown in laboratories and purchased in a supposedly standardized form, and use rennet that is reduced to a single enzyme. So everything has been done to remove a sense of provenance from modern industrial cheese. And unfortunately, even too often, even artisan cheese has to play by that same rule book, that is just seen as the modern, safe, and efficient way of making cheese. But I think there's actually some serious shortcomings to that approach, not just for creating foods that are delicious, but I think it's an inherently unsafe approach, based off a farming system that is um, horrendous.
you'd mentioned when you were in the commercial industry, used, I believe it's commercial starters or commercial rennet. Was this the vegetarian rennet from Pfizer that essentially a monopoly, it seems like now?
Yeah, and I'm glad that people are talking more about this, although there is still a lot of confusion about how it all works. But that is mainly what I was using. Commercial cultures. There's two companies basically that provide the cheese cultures for the world. One of them, Danesco, owned by DuPont, and the other one, C.H.R. Hansen, which got its start making rennet, and then is now one of the companies that makes the quote unquote vegetarian rennet, which I'm really trying to encourage people to move away from that name, um, because it kind of implies a lot of things, but it's like it implies the idea that the cheese is now vegetarian, and so it's always this dichotomy between animal rennet or vegetarian rennet. Whereas I think it should be maybe referred to as synthetic or GMO. Um, Based off of a process that Pfizer patented in '91, of a bioengineered organism, a yeast that produces just the enzyme that coagulates milk, chymosin. And this is what's used in the majority of cheeses in North America, and I would imagine the world. Um, and so these were the things that I learned to make cheese with, and the more I looked into those ingredients and the fact that they were coming from other continents, with really there's no transparency in these supply chains. As I learned, as I did research about rennet and tried to visit rennet facilities, they wouldn't even respond to me. And what's happening, it seems like, is that a lot of the animal rennet that's being used, and it's a smaller and smaller portion of the market, but it's all being sourced from New Zealand and Australia and shipped to the EU, turned into rennet, and then shipped to somewhere like North America. So it's this incredibly complex supply chain. Or you're working with the genetically modified source, which technically the product itself is just a single enzyme, chymosin, 100% chymosin, also known as fermentation produced chymosin, that is secreted by the genetically modified organism. So it's like kind of like a tricky gray area how we define these things. But what I'm hoping to do with the discussion that I have about rennet is to kind of confront the ethical dilemma of consuming milk and living with dairy animals. And I think it inherently implies the death of animals, and that there maybe shouldn't be, that I personally don't consider there to be such thing as vegetarian milk or cheese, because death of animals is implied. And I mean, we're talking about a fluid that comes out of an animal's body. So these are some of the conversations I'm hoping to have, and to move past a black and white dichotomy with rennet as being either plant or animal or vegetarian, and realize that there's it's a more nuanced um, collection of enzymes that are under this umbrella term rennet, including some that are actually plants, that will coagulate milk, that have been used historically and to this day.
Is there such a thing as a truly vegetarian rennet or something that is suitable for vegans?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so, because there are certain plants, most famously cardoon thistle, that have enzymes that will coagulate milk. So will nettle, fig sap, papaya sap, lady's bedstraw. These are all plants that have historical usage as rennet, but they can be really tricky to work with. But I think there are like rennets that these are the alternatives to animal rennet that I am most interested in, and that I have worked with and looked into. Um,
Terrific name, I have to say. Ladies' bedstraw.
yeah, Gallium verum, and I think it's also used as a dye. It has like a bright yellow or orange color. Um, and there's a history of its usage in the UK to make cheese. So those are the alternatives that I'm interested in. But animal rennet is the original. Like, it's these enzymes they adapted or evolved to coagulate milk, and that's their function. So they do the best job. And it's a fascinating process of how rennet is made that we've really lost touch with in North America, and it's really hard to find information about how to do it. And so I did research in the past on this topic for a research award called the Daphne Zeppos Teaching Award, and I recently acquired more funding from the same endowment, Daphne Zeppos Teaching Endowment, to go to France and visit a rennet making facility that works with French calves to make their rennet, which is a really unique, to have a domestic source. And then I'm going to talk to cheesemakers that use that to make their cheeses, to try to learn how it impacts their cheese and how they feel about working with a rennet that's actually sourced from within their own country.
I did find it interesting when you mentioned that the rennet comes from a convoluted way via Australia, New Zealand, through Europe to the US. And maybe that's just indicative of the complexities of the cheese industry here, because
Mm,
you would think that there would be a ready source of rennet in this country just for the beef production alone or animal production.
yeah,
But, it's there is a source here, but it's not clearly not being used or produced.
absolutely. There's a huge source. Like, there's still a massive amount of especially young male animals who are um, being killed at birth or sold at auction. And the the revival of rennet making would require the revival of veal. Like, the two things go hand in hand. And this was a part of my findings, was that in the places where cheesemakers are still making their own rennet, they're also celebrating the consumption of these very young milk drinking animals that are essentially being sacrificed, so that the milk that they would otherwise be drinking can be used by humans to make cheese. So it's like that link is always there, and I think it's an important link. That where people are still making rennet, they are also consuming those young animals, and it's oftentimes a part of like a seasonal, either like a springtime celebration. Like we have a vestige of this in springtime lamb, um, and so that's why rennet really gets to these ethical issues, doesn't it? Around what it means to live with animals and to consume meat and milk. And I'm always trying to kind of have the conversation include both of those elements. I think they go together. Um, but yeah, the fact that this has become so globalized and with every ingredient in cheese, um, I think shows a system that seemed efficient at a certain point in time, but is now showing its true inefficiency. And you can just see all around us in every aspect of food and culture, attempts to relocalize, right? And to ask, how can we produce cheese that is a true local product? And it has to start, in my mind, with looking at these ingredients, with these four primary ingredients, um, and and asking how local is our cheese if only the milk comes from here and the salt, comes from who knows where, and the rennet and cultures are being purchased from a European company. So it's there's a long story about how we got here, but I'm more interested in looking at what the future can be and asking what we can do here in Europe or North America to reclaim some of the wisdom and validity of these older approaches to making cheese and to having a knowledge of the sourcing of each ingredient. Ideally, having it be coming from as close to where we are as possible.
No, well, it's certainly a very complex question philosophically and I guess logistically and
Mm.
morally, I suppose. Maybe I'd like to ask about countries that are known for their cheese making, let's say like France. Have you found anybody there that is doing something different or taking a new approach to cheese making, or maybe an older approach, depending how you want to phrase it?
So I haven't really visited France yet. I've been avoiding it, or as I tell French people, I've been saving the best for last. Um, it's a little intimidating, and it's like, again, it's like the focal point of this Eurocentric model of what cheese is, but it's unavoidable for me to not go. And I know now, like I've spent a few days there, and I've gone to a cheese shop, and just looking at the map of cheeses in France, it is I think it's going to live up to the hype. Um, as far as efforts to hold on to traditional cheese making processes and bring them into the modern era, I've seen some really good examples in Italy where there is so much of an effort to preserve these old ways, right? So one of the best that I could think of is a cheesemaker who I didn't get to write a chapter on in the book, but I've written about quite a bit before in a published article that's available on my Substack about a cheese called Ragusano that's made in Sicily, in southeastern Sicily, in an area that has really ancient wheat growing history. And like they've been growing wheat there since before the Romans. And wheat in conjunction with carob and olive trees. And in this like polyculture, kind of like silvopasture, and then they rotate the wheat. Like after they harvest wheat, they put in cattle, this specific breed from the area, beautiful, like uh, brown red cattle called the Moticana cattle, and they clean up all the stubble, and like eat the remaining straw, and they fertilize and kind of like work organic matter into the soil. they then let it grow as like wild pasture for a year or two before plowing and planting wheat again. So this is how they've managed to grow wheat on the same soil for like thousands of years, like working with livestock as the cycler of nutrients and the like the the tool basically to maintain soil fertility. And of course they're also milking these cattle and producing this amazing cheese. Ragusano is like it's a member of a family of aged mozzarella style cheeses known as stretched curd or pasta filata. And it's like this brick shaped cheese that's made in wooden vats where the vat itself soaks up a little bit of whey from the previous batch of cheese and releases it into the next batch as a starter culture. So the culture is like this continuously fed whey based starter culture that's being absorbed in this wooden vat. They have specific tools for every step of the process. It's like a cheese that has its own kit of wooden tools. And of course, the use of wooden tools is frowned upon by modern food safety, by the modern food safety paradigm. And it's seen that wood is a material that can harbor bacteria and microbes, and that's absolutely true, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. So there's been cheeses where the makers have fought to keep the wooden tools, and these cheeses have been studied, and it's been like documented the efficacy of using wood as a material, that it can be done very safely. And then it's so for me, this is a part of another approach to food safety of partnering with microbes and encouraging them to live and kind of like flourish in the spaces where we make cheese. So Ragusano is a great example of that cheese. And there's one cheese maker, Guido Masseri, who makes it in the Donna Fugata Castle close to Ragusa. And so anyone can go there. Like you can take the train up from Ragusa, and his creamery is like a living museum. Um, and we need more people like that doing this work of farming, making cheese, and kind of refusing to modernize and refusing to succumb to the pressures of a food safety paradigm that too often I think isn't science based. And so that's a great example. And there's another cheesemaker that I did write a chapter about in the book. It's the final chapter in Austria. And the cheesemaker's name's Anton Suterluti, and he makes just these beautiful large wheel Alpine cheeses, again using a lot of old wooden tools and making cheese with a philosophy of increasing and embracing the complexity of it and allowing the cycles of nature into the process, which is kind of the opposite of the approach of like creating a box that you make cheese in where there's no input from outside. Even the air is filtered, and that like everything is sanitized, and that's the best, safest way to make cheese. I don't know that it is, and I'm trying to point to these examples of cheesemakers that seem kind of extreme. What they're doing seems extreme to a modern cheesemaker, but I don't know that it actually is, and that I think it has a very well time tested, has a very good time tested record of safely producing delicious cheese.
Yeah, well, certainly when you mentioned the wooden vats, my immediate thought was there's a bureaucrat somewhere that is going to try and phase that out. Yeah, I mentioned France because it is so Eurocentric and it is considered to be the center of cheese making. And I apologize for looking at my phone, but I wanted to look up this famous quote by de Gaulle. I don't know if you heard this one. The famous one is like, how can you govern a country which has 246 varieties of cheese? There's actually more now, but I think that says quite a bit.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. And it that quote is really good for a lot of reasons. First, it points out to the diversity of cheese in France, but also to the gastro nationalism of cheese, and the fact that like a lot of cultures really identify themselves with their fermented foods, and cheeses can become such a strong emblem of culture. So you look at France, and like obviously in general it seems like French people like know a lot about cheese and eat a lot of cheese, but then there's hyper regional cheeses in France, and that has been celebrated. That there's like, like in just the Loire Valley with the goat cheeses they make there, there's dozens of them like made in a different village with a slightly different shape, and they have their own name, which I think is a beautiful thing. But that diversity is being eroded, and cheese making in French has become fairly industrialized, as it has around the world. So it's with like most of the places that I go visit, I'm looking at this transition that's happening, and these cultures that are cultures and farming communities that are having to rapidly shift how they do things. And the question is like how much of the essence of these foods can be maintained, and how much should farmers actually be modernizing and and adapting and changing. And it's not a question that I'm going to answer. I think it has to be up to the individuals and the communities themselves. But it's a question that I'm interested in asking them. Like what does the future look like for this cheese and for the people who are going to be making it in the future, the farmers of the future. So the question is like, are children and young people going to take up this work? And there usually is a pretty dismal prospect about the survival of these old ways. It's stronger, obviously, in places like Italy, France, the UK, where these cheeses are celebrated and there's like economic incentives. But in a lot of these countries where it's like old shepherds in like the mountains in Albania, they say the same thing. They're like, we're the last ones. No one's going to want to do this after us, and there's no future in it. It seems to me like the places where the future seems a little brighter, is where there is a combination of nonprofits or like private sector investment in this stuff, or like forms of development that are actually set up to assist the communities and put money in their pockets, along with some sort of governmental support, and that it takes like a combination of those things, along with activists within the community itself, and young people wanting to stay and having the opportunities to make a living and stay in some of these more rural agricultural regions.
Yeah, that's always the fear that the young don't want to stick around. Just everywhere, it seems. I'm gonna backtrack a little bit. So you go to Mongolia, but how do you find these artisans, or I don't want to call them artisans, they're just people that make cheese. I don't think they consider themselves artisans.
Mm.
But how would you find cheesemakers in Mongolia or Albania? How would you get to these places and find them?
Yeah, this is a common question, and it's become a lot easier for me now as I have a bit of a track record, and I can oftentimes, so first I'll read a lot about a place, and I'll choose a few regions within a country that seem to have the promise of places I can find these old cheeses. They often are the places where the old types of animals are being kept. That's like a huge clue. And if there'll be like one or two people who, or an organization who are working towards the promotion, protection, revitalization of these cheeses and dairying foodways. And if I can get that person or organization to help me, and oftentimes they are very helpful when they hear about what I'm trying to do, then that one person can open all the doors for me that I need, and so they can make the introductions, help me like plan visits, and sometimes even come along with me or help me find a guide who can also serve as like a interpreter. Um, a country like Mongolia, it's very easy to find cheesemakers because cheesemaking is still something that's a part of the domestic tasks of having livestock. And you milk your animals and then you make cheese. It's like a part of the daily chores. And so in Mongolia, you could literally just like start driving around and pulling up at people's yurts in the summertime. So July, August, September, and you would probably see cheese making. It's ever present. Um, and in the case of Mongolia, when I was just starting to do this research, I just started talking to, I was in Mongolia making cheese, like working for a company making cheese. And I just started talking to people and telling them like what I was interested in learning about. And and I met this woman whose family like lived in the countryside, and she was more like in the city now, so kind of like in between worlds. But she took me and we stayed with her family for 10 days. And and I learned all about like how they herd yaks and make cheese. And so it was just meeting, it's like meeting the right people who have helped me open these doors. Or sometimes I've just gone to a region and just like kind of started walking and staying in guest houses and just like poking around and asking questions, until I found what I was looking for. Um, and at other times, it takes an incredible amount of flexibility and travel planning, and especially like when you're trying to go with shepherds when they're on the move, it can be hard to find them, or to they don't necessarily have like definitive plans of like, we're going to leave to go to the highlands on this specific day. They'll maybe choose the day a week in advance, which is the case with this person I'm going to walk with in Albania. I still don't know the exact day we're going to leave. I have to show up and be ready to go because it depends on weather and a host of other factors. So it's been a learning experience to have to let go of some of my desire to have like fixed plans and to be a little more willing to go with the flow and just showing up and being ready to learn. I think has gotten me this far. And there's also guided experiences, so that like there's places where you can go and stay and like pay to be there, and you can also like watch them make cheese, or they'll take you to go visit cheesemakers. So there's other examples of like experiential culinary tourism that would allow these experiences to be a lot more accessible to people, that I'm also starting to explore as well, like tours and things like this.
Were there any major discoveries that, it sounds like there's a lot of discoveries, but were there any that really just stand out in your mind?
Yeah, basically this idea that modern livestock breeds are better and more efficient, and that the older breeds that produce less milk, that those are just like antiquated breeds that are less valuable. I think that's false, and that actually the opposite can be arguably true. That in breeding modern livestock breeds to produce a huge amount of milk, we've lost other attributes of those animals. We've created animals that are weaker in other aspects of their existence. It's basically like this myopic focus on just breeding for one thing means that you're losing everything else. You're losing the ability of animals to feed on forage that grows from the ground. It's like animals become um, they have nutritional requirements to have like grain being fed to them, or they won't be able to produce a same amount of milk. And that these older breeds that maybe produce less milk, they have all these other traits that at first I was like listing the traits, and I would see them on like a description of the breed where it would say they have good mothering ability, and they can survive on meager forage, and they can handle like long walks on rough terrain. And I quickly realized that these weren't traits of specific breeds. These were traits of cows, of goats and sheep before we bred those things out of them. And that so there's a huge trade-off. And so whether these older breeds are more or less efficient depends on the farming system that you're working with them in, and your view of what efficiency means. But I've seen, and I argue for the resilience and the efficiency of a lot of these older breeds, and just the pure fact that their genetic diversity is a good thing, and this incredible treasure, the genetic wealth of pastoral people who have kept these animals and bred them into like different lines for so long, that's being decimated, and that's even more tragic than the loss of the cheeses. So this has been a big insight for me, realizing the actual value of these breeds, and that the it's this relationship with humans and animals, breeding them to fit a place and a farming system that the cheeses have grown out of. Um, and and I think that's kind of been eye opening for me. It's also been eye opening to see that in a lot of the world, no culture is used when cheese is made, meaning they're not adding something to ferment the milk. They're working with the microbes that are just indigenous to raw milk, and they're able to rely on those to consistently ferment cheese or ferment milk into cheese. So in a lot of the world, only rennet is added, and this is historically how cheese has been made. You put rennet in milk and you make cheese, and it ferments spontaneously. Or the microbes are living as a culture on the equipment that's being used to milk into, and to make cheese in. That act of making cheese daily was like feeding a culture on cheese making equipment. So that's also been an eye-opening thing to realize, that as I'm looking for these natural cheese making approaches where they're not using the commercial starter cultures, by far the most common naturally fermented approach is to not use any starter culture and just to ferment milk on its own. But that requires milk that is alive with healthy bacteria. And so this has pointed to me a huge issue with the raw milk movement in the US in particular, but in Europe as well, that we're pushing for raw milk, but it actually oftentimes doesn't have a lot of bacteria in it. We're intentionally trying to keep the levels of bacteria low in our raw milk. And I don't know that that's necessarily the best approach. I mean, I understand why it's done, but what I've seen in a lot of the world is milk that is still healthy, that has a healthy microbiome. And this can be correlated to humans with healthy microbiomes. And just like the fact that diversity, ecological diversity is a good thing on every level. And that it's that diversity and the strength of these microbial communities that can be the basis for the safe fermentation of milk into cheeses that are expressions of the place and culture from in which they're rooted.
Well, certainly, I see what you're saying about the animals for sure. I mean, I think a cow that's going to go up an Alp twice up and down the Alps is going to be in pretty good shape and probably a lot happier too. And certainly the
Yeah.
diversity of the food would really help things. So I think you may have touched on this possibly last question is what's next? You mentioned your trip.
Yeah. So when I'm in Europe this year, I'll have a workshop in collaboration with another educator in Biella, Italy, called Methods of the Mountain. So that's in September, and then in October I'm doing a guided tour in Spain, in Asturias and Galicia. That's like open to the public. A all expenses included kind of gastronomic tour of some of the cheeses of that region and how they fit in to the culture and cuisine. And I'm exploring doing more stuff like this, guided trips and collaborative workshops. So I'm going to continue to teach sour milk school, natural cheese making workshops. I'm probably going to start on a second book that will be recipe focused, recipes and techniques of natural cheese making. And I'm always searching for a place to kind of set up a home base and to, have a more permanent home as I get older and start to desire that in my life. So I'm looking for somewhere to make cheese non-commercially and to work with people who are milking animals and to be involved in fermentation and cheese making on like a community level is the goal for me in the future. And there's a lot of countries I'd still like to visit, but Turkey and Romania are high on the list, and I hope to really go in depth in those places in the coming years.
Where can you mentioned doing some education? Where can people find out information about what you're doing?
I post on Substack and Instagram as Milk Trekker, and I have a website for the school. So Sour Milk School is the website, and then there's links to all these other things and to purchasing the book Cheese Trekking. And those are my main sources of information and interface if people are interested in learning more about the project and upcoming events in the future.
I've really enjoyed the conversation, Trevor. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Congratulations on the book and best of luck with it. I know it's getting a lot of publicity and some good word of mouth out there. Congratulations on all that. And
Thank you, James. I appreciate it.
And safe travels. Once again, our thanks to Trevor Warmedahl for taking the time to talk with us about his book, Cheese Trekking. I thought the birds in the background were a nice touch. To learn more about Trevor and what he does, you can visit him at Substack at Milk Trekker, Instagram at Milk Trekker, and his educational and travel programs, sourmilkschool.com. Or you can always just visit us at booksaboutfood.com. I'm James Freeford, your host, and until the next time, happy reading.